I mean, the army's used depleted uranium in a lot of wars. It used it in the First Gulf War, and there's a lot of organisations that are campaigning against the use of depleted uranium, and there's a lot of pictures and there's a lot of evidence about the effect that had in Iraq after the First Gulf War, and there's lots of terrible pictures of the effect that it's had on children that are born, and lots of horrible deformities. I mean, the cancer rate in Iraq is astronomical. I think they use depleted uranium in Kosovo as well, and the army in Kosovo are allowed to drink the water. They have bottled water brought into Kosovo, but obviously the people who live in Kosovo do drink the water supply, and the army have used depleted uranium in Iraq. I presume they're using it in Afghanistan as well. The army says that it doesn't cause cancer. Well, if it doesn't cause cancer, then why are they not allowing their soldiers to drink the water? You know, it's going to take years and years to clear up all the uranium dust, and there's masses and masses of evidence that says that it does cause cancer. Though I'm not, like I say, I'm not an expert, but yeah. So it's just another weapon that the army shouldn't use. That they do use, like the British government has said that it won't use landmines. Yet it still uses cluster bombs, which are in effect a landmine that no one knows where they are, and they use cluster bombs in civilian areas in Iraq. And they drop them from the air, and they break up into little clusters. They bounce everywhere. There was cases of them bouncing inside people's houses who were shelling from the bombs. And they blow up, so they're pretty indiscriminate, so they should be illegal because they don't discriminate between a military target and a civilian target. But if they're not blown up, they lay there on the floor. And they're quite pretty when they drop them in Afghanistan. They looked a bit like the food packages. I think they're orange, and they look like the food packages. For some reason, the Americans thought it'd be a good idea, while they're bombing people, to win hearts and minds, let's also drop other things from the air that they want people to pick up. And, you know, children were going to pick up the food packages because they're starving, and they're ended up getting blown up by the cluster bombs. So, yeah, so it's another weapon that the army shouldn't use. Like white phosphorus, for example, is another weapon that they did use in Fallujah. White phosphorus sticks to the skin and it burns you alive, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't get it off, you can't wash it off. Well, to me, the religious argument hasn't really washed. I know a lot of Muslims have thought that it is a war against Islam. I think that's a good pretext that sort of the invaders can use, because they found it very easy to stir up fear and hatred against Islam. And in a way, it's in their interests, with some sectors of the population, for them to think that it is a war against Islam. And some people come up to us on the stalls and say, you know, Islam's such a terrible threat, it's a threat to the nation, and all this sort of crap. But personally, I think it's a war for resources. It's a war about power. I think Afghanistan was largely about revenge. I mean, there's the Project for the New American Century, which is a public document that you can look at on the internet, which was a document formulated by the neocons, and it outlines where they want America to go sort of in the next 50 to 100 years, and it looks at America's strategic position in the world. Now, America's relative economic strength in relation to other emerging nations is declining, and it will probably continue to decline. But what America does have, which gives it its biggest competitive advantage over anybody else, is the amount of weaponry it's got and the technology for weapons that it's got. It spent, in 2001, I think it spent about £400 billion on weapons every year, and that's gone up. I don't know what the figures are for 2007, but I know it's higher than it was in 2001. And America, to me, America is using that competitive advantage, that strategic advantage, to take a stake in important parts of the world. And there's no doubt that Afghanistan strategically is a very important part of the world in terms of the country that it borders, in terms of its relationship to the Caspian Sea, where there's thought to be massive oil supplies. They want to build a big oil pipeline through Afghanistan. Iraq is thought to have the second largest amount of oil in the world, and not only that, it's very easy to get out of the ground. Obviously, there's oil in different parts of the world that's much harder to extract. And it's not so much that America needs that oil now, because it produces its own oil, it gets oil from South America. But America doesn't want its competitors to have that oil. Just before the sort of rumblings of war with Iraq, Iraq was talking about doing big trades with China and France. Iraq was talking about trading its oil in euros rather than in dollars, and this is like a big threat to America. And to me, it's about oil and it's about strategic power in that part of the Middle East. The fact that America had a massive troop presence in Saudi Arabia since the first Gulf War was helping to destabilise the Saudi regime, something that America doesn't want, because although the Saudi regime is brutal in lots of ways, it does America's bidding, and it wants that regime to stay stable. And what better way than to get the troops out by just putting them next door in Iraq, right next to Iran, which is America sees as a strategic threat as well, and would like to get its hands on Iran's considerable natural resources. So that's my take. I think the religion part is a side screen. I think the main issue is about strategic power and grabbing resources using America's strategic advantage, which is its weapons system. I think with Halliburton and other countries with it, I think Dick Cheney used to be on the board of Halliburton, and Halliburton actually still sort of pay him. I think it's just a sign of the corruption, really, of the war. I mean, they got awarded absolutely massive contracts. They've made billions out of Iraq. Lots of companies have made billions out of the war with Iraq, including security companies like Blackwatch. Might not be called Blackwatch, you might have to edit that. Blackwater, thank you, yeah. Blackwatch is a Scottish regiment. And I think it's just part of the corruption, there is a sense in that capitalism can make lots and lots of money out of wars. And what better way to make lots and lots of money by flattening an area and then going in and rebuilding it. And the American taxpayers have been robbed by these companies because, ordinary American people, a lot of them are living in terrible poverty. They don't have a welfare system, they don't have an NHS system. I think their child mortality rate is higher than Uzbekistan. I mean, it's really terrible. They have, there's people that have got 3 jobs in America that still have to queue up at soup kitchens. I mean, the situation for ordinary American people is quite desperate. And yet the American government, which is controlled by the top section of society, they've got interests in American capital that are profiteering from this war, have robbed the American people of these billions and millions of pounds, and they haven't been spent to the benefit of the Iraqis. It's a lot of it's been wasted. I mean, they bombed the hell out of Fallujah, and they've built a brand new business park there. Business zone, it's totally empty. How can you have business in a zone where I think the doctors in Fallujah said 30 children die in Fallujah every day? They've not rebuilt the hospitals in Fallujah. This money's been stolen from the American people, and it's not helped the poor Iraqi people either. It's lining the pockets of the people that run the rich American corporations. Well, there's been a massive amount of legislation that's been brought in under the guise of the war on terror. The most frightening of which, I think, is the ability now of the police to detain people for, I think it's 24 days you can now be detained for, without being charged with anything. In New York, it's 7 days, so why in this country does it need to be so much more? The government has tried to push it up to 42 days, but luckily that was defeated because in the Lords, so unfortunately not in the Commons, because it was so unpopular. People's right to protest and demonstrate has been curtailed enormously. There's a whole zone around Parliament, supposedly, the heart of democracy, a beacon for the world, and yet you're not allowed to demonstrate within I think it's a mile radius of Parliament without getting permission from the police for 7 days in advance. And the police have to give you permission if you apply for it 7 days in advance, but they can limit the number of people who are allowed to demonstrate. They can limit the amount of noise you're allowed to make. So, for example, I nearly got arrested for having a megaphone on a demonstration, which you'd think was quite normal activity, but the police tried to take the megaphone off me and I wasn't going to give it to them because they're very expensive. They can limit what slogans you can use, they can limit what placards you can use and how many placards you can have. So, a massive constraint on your ability to demonstrate at the seat of power, because Parliament, is in many ways the seat of power. It's where the decisions are made, and that's where people should demonstrate.